Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm very happy to be joined today by a new author, Andrew Blosser, who is the author of this really fascinating book, The Ethics of Doing Nothing, Rest, Rituals, and the Modern World, published by Orbis. Andrew is a visiting assistant professor in theology at Marquette University. He received his PhD from Loyola University in Chicago. And I'm very happy to welcome him here today. This is an absolutely fascinating book, not only an interesting argument and theme, and very topical in terms of its relation to issues of climate change and economics, but it also is so beautifully written that I found myself just underlining like crazy and finding these sort of aphoristic sentences that just made me want to stop. They were almost like a sermon or a meditation in a single sentence. So just for the pleasure of that, I could recommend this book very highly. Andrew is dealing with a lot of interesting words, like work, inoperativity is a key word, another sort of way of doing nothing, but doing nothing not in just in the sense of being a couch potato, but more productive or not. That's not really that either. Well, I'll let him talk about that. But tying that in with ethics, ritual, and fascinating reflection on the meaning of Sabbath and how that could apply to ethics and apply to our world. Maybe, Andrew, welcoming you here, I could just give you an opportunity first to kind of talk about how those sort of concepts and words fit together and what you're trying to do in this book.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. It's a privilege to speak with you. In terms of the language, I do like to play around with irony, not just because it's fun, but also because it can help to communicate some of the complexity of these ideas. So the title, the phrase, doing nothing, is, as I'm sure that you gathered from reading it, partly ironic, but also partly a way to explain an idea which you find in philosophical literature, which sounds very boring. And to be honest, it does give off the aura of what are these people talking about, this highfalutin term, inoperativity. And inoperativity, of course, does not mean just doing nothing, as you said, in the sense of being a couch potato, but it refers to a state of being that does not have a purpose outside of itself, which paradoxically, and this is where the irony comes in, can involve doing something. So if you think about Sabbath, for example, Sabbath in Jewish communities as well as Christian communities that celebrate it or even celebrate Sunday and the ritual of Sunday, is a time of doing. There's a lot of activity that happens on Sabbath. It also applies to prayer. Even the most quintessential religious ritual itself, the act of praying, is a form of doing nothing. And I've said this to groups of both secular people, non-religious people, as well as very traditionally religious people. And I get some interesting reactions when I say that. I often tell them, that prayer accomplishes nothing. And immediately the more religious people almost get up in arms and say, wait, no, that's not true. And they're right, because prayer does accomplish something, but it also accomplishes nothing. And when I say it accomplishes nothing, what I mean is you cannot change God by prayer. This is something that you find in the religious texts themselves. Jesus himself says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. And I remember as a young child in a religious environment hearing that and saying to myself, then why are we doing it? And the answer, of course, is, well, you're not changing God. You're not getting anything from God by prayer. You are changing yourself in a way. You're becoming a different type of person by praying, but more specifically, you're inhabiting a different identity. You are being something altered by prayer. And that altered state of being, which does not have a purpose outside of itself, is what inoperativity is. That's what I mean by doing nothing in the title of the book. book. So that's essentially what the exploration trajectory of the book is, exploring what it means to do or be something that doesn't have a purpose outside of itself.
Well, in our kind of culture, people would ask, why would you do something that has no purpose outside of itself? And you relate that a lot to our relationship to work and how that functions in our economy and our society, and even how people have based that on kind of biblical ideas. So that you the kind of work ethic and how that ties in with a sense of virtue.
Yes. So I'm a teacher. My main job, what I do for a living, is to teach students. And I teach college students who have a very interesting outlook on life, which might even be quite different from the one that I had when I was in college about 15 years ago, which isn't really that long. But there has been a change, partly, I think, as a result of increasing costs and financial incentives in the form of being indebted. And we don't have time to go into all that. But there's a general sense that one must learn to do that which makes the most money possible. And this is treated by most college students, and I don't think it's their fault. I think it's the predicament that they have been thrusted into. But there's a general sense that one has a moral obligation to make of oneself a money-making entity, to instrumentalize oneself, not just one's activity, but also one's mind. You have to turn your mind into the type of thing that creates value, understood as material production. And that has informed our work ethic, and there's a long history to that. We could talk about Max Weber, of course, wrote a famous volume on that. There's a change in the way that work is viewed in the world as a result of industrialization and the fact that the machine has become the icon of value for many human beings. What I try to do in the book is point out that in religious traditions, specifically, Christianity and Judaism, there is a sense, and it's also in Islam, but we don't have time to go into that as well. I just want to highlight that because that's something that needs to be explored more. But in Christianity and Judaism, there's a sense that human life has a purpose which culminates in the Sabbath. So the Sabbath, as Heschel, a famous Jewish rabbi, one of the leading Jewish thinkers of the last century, what Heschel says is that the Sabbath is not, in Jewish tradition, a break. So we do have in our culture, and most people are probably aware of this, you can just look at book titles or look at seminars or the way people post on social media. People do have a recognition that we need work-life balance. We need rest, right? You're not going to get maximal output from your employees if you have them working nonstop, right? They'll become inefficient, they'll make mistakes, and so on and so forth. So we do have this sense, we need rest. But we have a tendency, and when I say we, I mean those of us in the general Western or European American culture, as well as some other parts of the world, increasingly in Asia, this is a problem. We do have a sense we need rest, but we tend to instrumentalize it. We say that rest is for more work. You need to take time off so that you can show up again at the office and work better. And Heschel vehemently disagrees with this, and also a number of other Christian thinkers as well that I talk about in the book. They say this is a flawed conception of what rest is supposed to be for. There is that kind of utilitarian rest that you need, but Sabbath is not that. Sabbath is the purpose for the work that you are doing in the other 6 days of the week. It's not to pave the way for work, it's what work is ultimately for, which is a dramatic change in thinking about the nature of rest, not as just a pathway to more work, but as an end in itself, as inoperativity. And so the argument that I make is that we ought to try to structure our lives, and not just our personal lives, but also our economies and even our ecological activism in such a way as we expand the category of Sabbath so that it becomes the end for which we design all our work. So Jurgen Moltmann says we need to season our work with Sabbath. We need to orient our work towards Sabbath, and that's what I'm trying to do. So it's a subtle distinction, but it's a major distinction, because if you think of rest as just another way to get more work done, eventually rest itself dissipates because it's not the purpose, and that's what I'm trying to avoid.
And a lot of the ways that we so-called rest, in our leisure time actually exhaust us more, and that's not rest at
yes,
all.
if I could just add that, or they are work themselves. And this is the fascinating thing, that in especially with younger people, rest has become an obligation, not in the sense of I need to restore or rejuvenate myself, but I need to consume certain amounts of leisurely commodities. Most people are probably aware of this. Some people have done this and just will never admit it openly. But I have noticed some people will go on vacations and take multiple photos of themselves in different locations on the vacation. So, for example, if they're going to, I don't know, an island in the Pacific, they'll take photos of themselves in California. If they live on the East Coast, they'll take photos in California and then at other stops on the way there. And then over the rest of the year, they can post these photos on social media in such a way that it makes it look like they're traveling frequently on different types of vacations. And of course, there's an explanation for this in the work of Thorstein Veblen. But what this is it's a way of saying, of showing that one is accomplished. It's a way of saying, look, I have the resources, I have worked to put myself into a position whereby I have the status that is associated with someone who can rest. So it's a form of resume crafting in or through the means of leisure, which explains then why in some cases people who go on vacations are not rested when they get back, because all they've been doing is working on their resume through the entire vacation. And it goes under the name of leisure, but it's not leisure. And of course, at a broader economic level, that's connected to, of course, the tourism industry, the fact that you need people to travel in order to create jobs for other people who enable people to travel. This was, of course, a big source of the economic downturn during the pandemic. People weren't traveling. Anyway, so it's just one example of how you can think that you are resting, but in fact, you are already enmeshed in a pattern of work that hasn't really ended.
I'd go back to something again about the Sabbath that really struck me. You say theologians focus on the first 6 days of creation while God was doing all these things. And then on the Sabbath, God rested. But there's no indication that on Monday morning, God went right back to work again. But that the Sabbath was the goal. The Sabbath was this way of being in relationship to creation. And therefore, if humans are made in the image of God, again, Sabbath is not just our day off or a day to pray, but has something to do with the end or the purpose of our existence.
Yes, and that's a fascinating phenomenon that I talk about with my students in theology classes at university. We always start by reading Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. And the fascinating thing that you see, and it becomes even more clear when you realize, and we don't have time to go into all this, but Genesis chapter 2, beginning in verse 4, is starting the creation story all over again. So the creation story basically ends in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 2, the first one. And so it just ends with God resting. And it doesn't say then God started working, as you said, on Monday. And the ancient rabbis deliberated over what is the meaning of this. What is God just constantly in a state? Did Sabbath for God, in a sense, ever end? Or is God still in a sabbatical state up until the present day? And what does that mean, given the fact that, of course, if you believe that God is maintaining the cosmos, how could God be resting while maintaining the cosmos and so forth? But what it does indicate, there's a lot of mystery there, but the clear indication is that Sabbath is the ultimate act of creation. It's what creation is for, in the sense that all the other work that led up to it was nothing but a series of stepping stones to that. If you don't have Sabbath, you don't have creation, you don't have a world, you don't have even a universe. That's what Sabbath is for. So Jurgen Moltmann says, well, you know what? The creation story is not there just to satisfy our curiosity about what happened millennia ago, or depending on whether you're a creationist or not, doesn't really matter. It's not there just to give us information about where we came from. Maybe it has value for that, another discussion, but it's there to inform our view about what goodness is. That's the one word you see repeated over and over again in Genesis. God created this and saw that it was good. It's about what value means to humans. So if the creation story ends with God resting, that's a way of saying this is what value should mean to humans. Humans should put ultimate value on this thing that God puts at the pinnacle of creation. That should be our priority, which then means that all the acts of material manipulation that humans do as part of our daily lives, our work in the material sense, all of that has this end goal of being for inoperativity, rest, doing nothing. Here meant ironically is not doing all the material stuff that we put value on in our economy, but it's the stuff that is necessary for that rest to occur. Right? So it creates a different vision for Moltmann, not just for human being individual lives, but also for history. We ought to think of history as leading toward rest, as paving the way for greater forms of rest, which means manipulating not only our economies, but also the way we think about our civilization as such. It is something that should exist for rest. And maybe at the current state, it doesn't. And that's a problem.
Well, you brought in the word goodness, which connects interestingly with the question of ethics, which is in your title. And you say that we often think of ethics as kind of rules or precepts for behavior, but it actually means something different, doesn't it?
Yeah, so ethics, I teach ethics courses, and a lot of students come into those courses assuming that I'm going to tell them what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. Within traditional Catholic thought, the term for this is casuistry, right? The idea of rules and figuring out what rules are for and which rules apply and which don't. And there's value in that. I'm not saying that that's illegitimate. But ethics more properly, or the best way to think about it in a creative and fruitful way, is to think of it as figuring out how to live a good life, or what is my life for ultimately. And so if Sabbath is what life is for, if that is the ultimate good state of human beings, that then necessitates a sabbatical ethic. It means we ought to look at things in our lives and in our economies and ask ourselves, how sabbatical is this thing? Is it leading to that state of being that corresponds to what God does on the seventh day? And once you start looking at the world that way, you start to identify all kinds of things that seem not only not sabbatical, but engendered toward opposing Sabbath. We actually create, whether consciously or not, unnecessary forms of work, partly because we value work in and of itself as an intrinsic good, as possibly even our highest state of being. Maybe not consciously, maybe we don't say this openly that we believe that being a working person is the highest state of being, but we create these realities which have no other explanation other than this idea of emulating more and greater work. And so we create artificial work for ourselves. One example that I go into in the book, and I've had numerous debates with my students about this, which is interesting, is the lawn. I've asked numerous people, every class that I teach, at least in ethics courses, I ask people, what has your lawn ever done for you? And now I don't judge people for having lawns. Most people who have lawns, this is interesting, we could go into a long digression on this, but there are legal requirements in many states and local neighborhoods, homeowners associations. You have to have a lawn and you have to keep it mowed at a certain level. But I ask students, well, why? What pleasure, what value does your lawn bring to you? Now, this is where it gets interesting, because some students, you would think that my opposition or my cynical attitude toward lawns would be applauded by students, especially when teenagers, they're often having to mow the lawn. But a lot of them, way more than you might expect, immediately say, well, I get a feeling of gratification from mowing my lawn. I feel almost morally accomplished
Hmm.
from having mowed my lawn. And there's a lot of perhaps Pavlovian associations there, the smell. Um, it's very, very complicated. So if you go into the history, Virginia Jenkins has written a book about the history of the lawn that I cite there. The origin of lawns, they have a very brief vintage, actually, in historical terms. Most people, hundreds of years ago, did not have lawns. But they emerged in the late 1700s and early 1800s as a way to show that one had other people working for one. If you were a noble person in Europe, you had these large expanses of ground that were cleared, and you wanted to show that you had additional labor, servant labor, and that you had the ability to maintain these unnecessary spaces by employing people to groom them, to mow them, and so forth. And then, of course, people began to imitate that as a way of showing that they too perhaps didn't have servant labor, but could work themselves and could create these urban green spaces and expand them. And so as the United States developed and as we spread westward into areas that were occupied by other people, which sometimes were taken quite frequently from those people, we started expanding these green spaces, unnecessary green spaces, with mowing in order to show how hard at work we were. And so if you have a neighborhood in the suburban part of the United States, everybody in that neighborhood, in a sense, is trying to compete by showing to their neighbors, I'm a hard worker, I keep my lawn mowed, I'm just as hardworking as you. And so it's a way of showing we are hardworking people. And it's gotten to the point, and I don't believe I cite the statistic in the book. This is something I encountered recently, a study done by NASA. Green lawns, that is to say turf grass, is the largest cultivated crop in the United States. So the amount of green lawns that we have, turf grass that we have in the United States, equals a space about the size of the state of Georgia, which is enormous. It requires watering. It has all kinds of ecological impacts we could talk about. But what it's there for is to show that we are hardworking. It's now it has other purposes. You can play sports and so forth. But if you go to most suburban parts of the United States, you don't really see people using their lawns. Some small space of the lawn is used by the pets, and maybe the kids are playing in the backyard. But a lot of it is just there to show I am a hardworking person. I either have someone else to maintain it, or I maintain it myself. I'm in charge of things. I am an upstanding citizen. So it's a status symbol of work. So that's just one example of how we create more work than we need to do because we think work itself is valuable. And that's
let me ask you a challenge that question there, because I'm not going to defend lawns, but picking up on what your students were saying, and I think it's something you don't really get into in the book, is the idea of work, a kind of spirituality of work, in which you can find a sense of purpose or meaning, even in something that is not productive, even in something that, any kind of job that you might have to do. And you don't refer, very much, for instance, to that kind of Benedictine tradition of work and prayer as being kind of two sides of the same thing, so that you can work in a spirit that is prayerful, is inoperative in your sense, while you're actually doing something, and it's different than leisure.
Yes, that is a great point. How I would respond to that is that work, of course, is meaningful, and it can have enormous benefits, including spiritual benefits, but only when it is seasoned by a telos, when it has a goal that is outside of itself. And that goal, of course, is Sabbath, is that doing nothing, which is defined as being in the presence of ultimate goodness, which can be found in other people. And so some of our best experiences in work come about when we are doing something that we truly do believe has ultimate value, has value for other people, and we do that in the presence of other people who have that same goal. And I think that's what Jurgen Moltmann meant by, or means by, the idea of seasoning work with Sabbath. It's having that end goal in mind, which can be very different, is very different from doing a job that you think doesn't have much value, which anthropologists like David Graeber have discovered can in fact be even soul destroying, type of spiritual violence. So there are different types of work in the category of work itself, is how I would respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous spiritual classic by Brother Lawrence, 17th century Carmelite, the practice of the presence of God. He worked in the kitchen, and he has this great spiritual genius, and he talked about how there was no difference for him between chopping vegetables and praying. He could bring a prayerfulness to that kind of menial task, which of course is not meaningless. He's preparing food for other people, but you could apply that. His idea was to almost anything, mowing the grass included.
Yeah, there's the notion of contemplation in action, which is a big part, of course, of Ignatian spirituality. The idea you're finding God in all things. The challenge, though, becomes, can there be systems of work in which you don't have a sense that you are truly contributing to the well-being of others? Possibly you're even doing the very opposite, taking from others. So a lot of the jobs that people find to be very soul destroying in the current economy, in the research of people like David Graeber, are jobs in things like, and I don't want to stereotype anyone because there can be valuable work in all different quarters of the economy, but in things like finance, where at least in some cases, not all, but in some cases, the job can involve not contributing perhaps, but taking, predation, finding ways to derive value from others rather than giving it. And that's where you run into work, which is perhaps even the opposite of that sabbatically seasoned kind of work that Jurgen Moltmann talks about, right? So it's a tricky thing, and there's a lot more to be said than what I say in the book on the subject of work ethics. What does it mean to have a good work ethic? It sounds easy, but once you get into the weeds, it's really tricky.
Well, there's that kind of Buddhist ideal also of right livelihood, that some people don't have a whole lot of choice of what they're going to do. But when we can, to choose work that can be considered in some way as a service to others or to improving the world in some way.
Yeah, that is, and of course, that's a huge problem in that, especially with my students, many of them don't feel a lot of agency in the types of work that they have to do, and you certainly cannot fault them for that. And that's why partly I don't want to condemn people in finance, because we need people in finance, and also some of the people who are going into it, they really want to do good work. They want to contribute to the world. And the type of frustration that they experience is that sometimes in order to do that work, they get enmeshed in these tragic situations where what your boss asks you to do may be very different from what you aspired to do when you were in college and you were aiming to transform the world in these positive ways. And that can create enormous angst and a sense of even a violated conscience in some cases. So one of the projects that I'm working on right now actually is the question of how do you work in an environment that is morally tragic? How do you view yourself as a person, as an agent in a situation where there's a lot of ambiguity about what you're doing and whether it's contributing to the well-being of others? And as you said, some people may not have much choice. And of course, the perspective of a lot of Eastern traditions, including Buddhism, would be to, at the very least, bring an attitude of trying to avoid attachment to the types of things that lead to the covetousness and greed that can then distort that work, but doesn't solve all the dilemmas that we face. It's a really difficult area.
There are a lot of ethical questions, obviously, involved in work, and one could raises the question about, let's say, you're working for the cigarette industry, or you're trying to cut regulations on safety and health, and ecology or the environment or whatever, or the Oppenheimer movie that raises this question of should you work on devising a super bomb, an H bomb? Do you have any responsibility for what the consequences of that work might be?
Yeah, that's a huge issue, and I think it's significant. I actually have not seen the movie yet. Oppenheimer. I would like to. But one of the things that I noted, or I remember being described as in that movie, is this citation from the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
And now I have become the destroyer of worlds. I'm not sure which translation that he used. But that's a significant citation because I don't know that this is in the movie, which is why I got to see it. But the Bhagavad Gita is about that paradox of work in a sense. Right. It's the question of how do I do something that I find to be morally problematic? That's what Arjuna is being compelled to do in this battle against the Pandavas, right? He's got to do this war, war is always a terrible thing. And what Krishna instructs him to do is to act without attachment, which you define as being doing what you're doing, but not with a selfish motive, a motive of trying to take from others. And sometimes, of course, this applies perhaps not to war, which is something that we want to not happen at all. War is probably the most non-productive form of work that can happen. But the best we can do in some cases, if you're going to work on an atomic bomb, or you're going to cut regulations, or you're going to price gouge rent, or not pay for people's health care, or whatever kind of job you have, sometimes the best you can do might be to bring that attitude of non-attachment to that work, which is not satisfactory to me as someone interested in ethics. I would prefer to do the best thing in any given situation, which is, of course, not to have the war, not to have the atomic bomb, not to have a health insurance system that harms people. But when you're in that situation, a lot of my students go to become health insurance employees. Right? What can you do in those constraints to do the least harm that you possibly can? I don't know. I really don't. It drives me crazy, but it's the reality of being a single individual agent in a complex world where all these different forces are creating the reality you face.
Well, we're getting short on time.
Very hard.
We could jump to kind of the last chapter where you apply this to the problem of climate change and how the idea of inoperativity or Sabbath consciousness could have real practical, real world consequences for the future of the earth.
Yeah, so in the last chapter, and you can almost see this building throughout the book, but in the last chapter in particular, I look at the fact that climate change it has many causes in a way. In an economic sense, there's a lot of factors that are going on that are contributing to anthropogenic climate change, right? We have the way that our energy system is set up. We have patterns of consumerism. We have travel, housing, all sorts of issues. But you can think of climate change, in a sense, as the product of a society that is constantly trying to work more. We are in a system where the goal is to increase GDP. And GDP is a number that has many different meanings, but in a sense, you could simplify it as measuring the amount of stuff that's going on. Whether that be building things or destroying things, economists will tell you that you can boost GDP in an area by having a forest fire, because the forest itself is not producing any monetary value. And if you have a forest fire, you have to go pay firefighters to go put it out, as well as reconstruct some of the things it damages, which all boost GDP. So essentially, climate change is the outcome of work, excess work, wasted work. So to confront climate change, we have to think about creating a world with less work in it. And the way that this could practically change the way we focus on or address climate change is by thinking about technology in a different way. I'm in favor of any and all measures to try to address the nefarious impacts of climate change. I'm not trying to say that technology is bad, or that carbon capture technology is something we should avoid. I think we should try to pursue that. But at the same time, we need to be careful that when we're trying to address a climate problem, we don't run into a problem which is that we create a treadmill. We solve one problem only to create another one somewhere else, which is kind of what some theorists and researchers are finding is happening with things like greenwashing. Companies want to continue to boost their business, but they don't want to reduce the amount of stuff that's happening. And so they just find ways to compensate, to offset the notion of carbon offsets, the type of activity they're doing with maybe fixing a problem somewhere else, which is perhaps better than just doing reckless, unending, problematic behavior, but it doesn't really address the problem completely. The problem can only be addressed when you find ways to do less stuff. And I think our religious traditions teach us, specifically with regard to Sabbath, that we need to look at the earth as the subject of Sabbath itself. We need to give earth a Sabbath, which means we need to look at it not as just a repository of further stuff to do. And so one of the ways that can happen is by changing the way we approach climate activism by saying, maybe the point here is to actually figure out whether we can do less stuff in the first place. And that can change the way we encounter the climate movement.
Well, thank you very much, Andy Blosser. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. I'm envious of your students. It must be very exciting to be in your classroom. And I really urge everyone to read this fascinating book. You got a flavor of it today. The Ethics of Doing Nothing, Rest, Rituals, and the Modern World, published by Orbis Books. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. It was wonderful talking to you.